And that takes us to kind of where you were conjuring up this study. How could you study this in a way that would be very meaningful to show what you're explaining, but also show that, is this pathological, or is this the way the mechanism is supposed to work? Is this completely normal? And so tell us about how you decided to study this, and what components you thought were most important for that.
Yeah, so to what you're getting to is that you could almost say that there's two questions I've been exploring this whole time. Question number one is the one we mainly talked about just now, which is the mechanistic one, the why. And the why is a great and interesting question. It's also easy for me to do my own N of one experiments to help elucidate and learn about. The second one is the tougher one. It's the risk. Is it, this could even be, I could even be right about this, but is it still risky to just have high LDL? That is not easy. It's easy to understand what the data mean once you have it, but getting the data is very time consuming. It's very expensive. It's very hard. And so in 2017, when I'd written for the first time about the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, uh, I started having some more serious stories reach out to me. You mentioned Robin a little bit earlier, for example. I had really only known a lot of folks who were just kind of in it for the curiosity, but like me, they had the cheat codes. They could, step off of it, maybe not be keto, but be low carb-ish. But then the more that I came across people, particularly children, who had a special reason to be very low carb ketogenic, but had sky high LDL cholesterol, where do they go? What do they do? Because there's no data. There's just no data on risk as it associates. So for 2 years, I tried to go through the quote unquote normal channels. I tried to reach out to actual lipidologists, to cardiologists, to researchers in these fields and be like, let's do this. Let me tell you about these guys. This is a scientific opportunity because up until now, all of the data we've been working from are in clusters. They're in clusters of other cardiovascular risk factors to the degree that we don't know how much one is affecting the others. We just don't know, right? And the lipid energy model kind of hints to why it may be that we're overstating ApoB in its independent causality, and that indeed it may be possible that where LDL and ApoB are increased due to actual metabolic fat adaptation, that it may not have that associated risk, right? But again, over and over again, I would emphasize this is a hypothesis. Don't take it to the bank. Let's just get real data. So finally, 2 years later, after trying to knock down everyone's doors, I took a chance that I'll just say, Casey, I can never say this enough times. I really had no idea. I I'm sure in hindsight, people are just like, oh, Dave just keeps like charging forward with full certainty, and that's how he keeps. No, I really had no clue. And so I started building the Citizen Science Foundation before announcing it, spending a lot of money so that the lawyers would cross the T's and dot the I's, because I knew this. I knew if I was going to do this, I had to go all the way. Because of course, if the data did show that this was a low risk population, then of course it would be highly scrutinized. I would understand it getting highly scrutinized. So we had to do it the right way from day one. So I made it a bona fide public charity, which is not easy. Just telling you. For anybody thinking about doing it, just do GoFundMe unless you really want to go this far. And then I want a Houston stage, Low Carb Houston. Thank you, Dr. Nadir Ali, to make that announcement that I was starting up this charity. I was going to try to raise the money to just do this study ourselves. We'd find a research center. We did in Lundquist. Thank you, Dr. Matt Budoff, for taking it on and being the principal investigator. And yeah, we kicked it off. We would have gotten a lot further, a lot faster, but this whole like pandemic thing came up and it's
Never
really,
heard of it.
yeah, spoiled the party for us. like rain in Vegas.
Well said. And just to get an understanding of this as well, Matt Budoff, I was not as familiar with him. I know he's a big deal in cardiology. I was not as familiar with him. Is that because he's not necessarily a low carbohydrate guy? He's more in the cardiology space.
Correct. It's interesting because you only get to know these things after being in the space yourself. Even though he is a board certified lipidologist, he's very much a scan researcher. Like he's so deep into CT angiography and coronary artery calcification going way, way back. I mean, like 30 years ago back. And he was perfect in so many respects because he didn't really have so much of a dog in the LDL fight. If you listen to his prior talks, his interviews, it's hard to actually kind of tell where he's at. Um, for good reason, because he really does like to just go off the data he has in hand. So, more recently, even before our data were coming in, both himself and Karam Nassir were very upfront about a lot of this recent data, as shows the association of CAC and what's known as the power of zero. Karam speaks about it all the time online, which is that if you have a zero CAC, that's a coronary artery calcification scan. For, I'm sure you probably talked to your listeners about it, but I'm more bullish on it than I've ever been. It's not quite as good as a CT angiogram, which can also see soft plaque as well, but it's strikingly correlative, more so than I thought it was. And one of the biggest studies that really shifted my opinion much more so in that direction was out of Denmark, and it had 23,000 symptomatic patients. So to kind of set this up for you a little bit, because they've got a socialized healthcare system there, which is great for science. Basically, everybody who got referred to get a CT angiogram between 2008 and 2017 in Denmark, all of them, they ran this analysis between how much the CT angiogram data matched the calcification data and how much that also was impacted by the lipid data. How much did, for example, high LDL associate with cardiovascular disease outcomes? And if you had an LDL of 190 or higher, but you had a CAC of zero, it was not very predictive at all compared to virtually any other level, right? Now, I will caveat, and I'm sure they would want me to caveat as well. If you did have a positive CAC, situation changes. And so folks like Matt Budoff and Karam Nassir would say, oh, but if you do have disease, then you should be taking steps on it. But if you're a patient that's already kind of pushing back, um, and I've straight up asked them both, is it all right if I just relay what you have said, including in these presentations? That's their opinion. But that is a controversial opinion by like a lot of people in the lipid side of the fence that would say you should never have a high LDL under any circumstances. Even saying, hey, I have a high LDL, now I'm going to go get a CAC. Oh, the CAC is zero. Is that good enough for you, doctor? Again, they wouldn't say, well, that's the end of the road. They would probably say, okay, but let's, do another scan in like 5 years, something along those lines. But that still is important because it shows how the data that they themselves worked on and that they've helped to assemble, and that they're further influenced by with these other papers, that has informed their opinion, which is data driven in that respect. And so that's exactly who I kind of want as, the principal investigator for our study. Somebody who I feel like is going to go where the data takes them.
Perfect. Yeah, I could tell as he was talking, like he wasn't against low carbohydrate diets. He was definitely reading the room and knew who he was talking to, but you could tell he wasn't, a low carb guy. So, okay, I find that all very interesting. Fast forward, another special place, special room, low carb Denver 2023. Dave Feldman gets up on the stage with preliminary data, a starting point of where this study is going to start from. Who cares about a starting point? It's preliminary data. It's not going to show anything. You don't even know how the numbers change the very next day. Dave, that was incredible. Did you hear the gasp of 1,000 people all at once when you revealed what the preliminary data showed?
Yeah, it's this is one of those it's funny because as best as I can, I want to be an instrument of research. Obviously, obviously, whatever I'm working on, if it's a matter of research, it's something I can appreciate when we're finding out a group that's otherwise thought to be at a population level at extremely high risk, that they may, at a population level, may not be at extremely high risk, right? I say that with all of the appropriate caveats. This is preliminary, which I said there on the stage, preliminary, preliminary, preliminary. But I said this at the beginning of the study at my announcement of it at Low Carb Denver 2 years earlier. Or sorry, at Low Carb USA 2 years earlier. As I said, look, our study will do a decent job at providing strong data on the big magnitude question, which is why I shared in Low Carb Denver 2023. The big magnitude question, right? So the big magnitude question, and I said this then, scenario one is Dr. Budoff at some point in time calls me and says, we've got too many people showing up with advanced plaque. Sorry to tell you this, but your LMHR study is proving the lipid hypothesis at a population level. This group is clearly at enormous risk, right? That was always a possibility. Okay, now that we're done with the 100 scans and we're looking at it, I've already poured over a lot of this data before. It was such a cathartic moment that I wanted to show you guys images that came from the footage captured and get you in the room with me to get that, oh my God, this was not at least the high magnitude of effect that would be predicted by the lipid hypothesis. I Again, I want to give due to the people who are like, oh, I still think that there's a risk associated with it, but maybe it's suboptimal, right? So, for example, they may argue our participants may, in fact, prove to be at low risk, but they would be at even lower risk if they had their LDL lower. I conceded that point even before we did our first scan. But what people aren't realizing is how radically different, what a completely different landscape we're in already, that's even a concession. Because if we could go back in time like 8 years ago, and I could walk into that, that bar at a lipidology conference, I'll bet I could have laid down some fairly serious money for a bet that the averages I just reported to you guys, the LDL of 260 to 272 average with a mostly male cohort at an average age of 55 for almost half a decade at these levels, like it almost certainly would have shown a higher magnitude of risk given the amount of time that's passed and especially being at middle age. Now, one more thing. As I said then, and as I'll say now, it is longitudinal data. So we're getting the first scans, then we're getting the second. And I do want to manage expectations appropriately. Any group like the one I mentioned, even if they are lower risk than expected at baseline, any group at that age range, being mostly male, it's probably going to see an increase in plaque at a population level. It's just we're starting much lower than what the lipid hypothesis would have anticipated, given everything I know to this point in time. There's a let me just fit this last point in. There's something called cholesterol years. It's like pack years, sometimes called milligram years, right? And it's actually a great way to illustrate. It's a great heuristic to illustrate this exposure, dose exposure over time, and that the higher amount it is, the more you can just add it to the total. My own is probably around 7,500, which is around 2,500 more than what they say is the line we're supposed to avoid. And it happens to be close to the average of our cohort in our group. It's close to around 7,500, right? But after that Denver, as you know, that Denver 2023 conference, we eventually had Budoff's talk on the match analysis.
Yes.
And the match analysis, we're looking at that same group we just talked about, but now we're comparing it to another group called Miami Heart that's matched for age, ethnicity, all these other factors. And They did not have an average of an LDL of 272. They had an average of 123. But they actually had statistically no difference in plaque than our baseline scans for our group. And we actually were trending toward better. They actually had more overall plaque than we did. And again, I throw in the caveat, A, preliminary, B, I don't want to say ours is doing better because statistically significant difference. There's a lack of statistically significant difference. It's just that I do know that if our group was trending higher, probably it'd be assumed that, okay, our group is lower risk, but they're breaking away. They're eventually going to build into the statistically significant territory. So, yeah, there's, I want to be able to say it's good news so far without saying, and therefore we can stop. We can all, this is the end of the line. It's encouraging so far, with all of the appropriate caveats.